Mr. Thomas was told to put the pole down by officers, but refused and turned with the pole in his hand as if to strike the officer before he was tased and taken to custody. Witnesses on scene stated Mr. Ventress struck Mr. Thomas in the head with an air pump, that both men then began to fight, that Mr. Thomas then walked into his house and came back out with a large knife. The witnesses further stated that Mr. Thomas and Mr. Ventress continued to fight, and Mr. Thomas had, of which the blade broke on it. Mr. Thomas stabbed Mr. Ventress and then began to strike him in the head with several objects, and then began to kick him. Even after Mr. Ventress lay unconscious on the ground, Mr. Thomas continued to strike him in the head repeatedly with an air pump, poles, sticks, and other objects repeatedly. Witnesses stated Mr. Thomas swore he was going to kill Mr. Ventress. While Mr. Ventress was still laying unconscious on the ground, Mr. Thomas picked the large knife back up and stabbed Mr. Ventress in the back, and was in the process of stabbing him a second time in the back when another family member knocked the knife out of his hand and police began to arrive. Mr. Thomas was advised of his rights and agreed to give a statement. Mr. Thomas stated that he asked Mr. Ventress if Ventress had a problem with him. Mr. Thomas stated Mr. Ventress replied that he did not have a problem and that Ventress got on his bike and rode off. Mr. Thomas stated that Mr. Ventress then came back and exchanged words with him. Mr. Thomas stated he turned his head and Mr. Ventress struck him in the head with an air pump, and after that he went ham, blacked out, and lost control. Mr. Thomas stated he had it on his mind to kill Mr. Ventress after that. Mr. Thomas stated Mr. Ventress is the one that had the knife and that he took the knife from Mr. Ventress. Mr. Thomas stated they fought, but he doesn't remember stabbing Mr. Ventress. Mr. Thomas stated he did remember repeatedly striking Mr. Ventress in the head with the air pump that he had initially been struck with. Detectives asked Mr. Thomas if he struck Mr. Ventress after he lay unconscious, and Mr. Thomas stated that he did repeatedly and even kicked him a few times as well. Mr. Thomas stated that he intended to beat Mr. Ventress and that he knew that that was happening because Mr. Thomas was the one that was still standing. Mr. Thomas stated he didn't care what happened to Mr. Ventress again. Mr. Thomas stated a family member got him away from Mr. Ventress, but when he saw another stick, he picked it up to go beat on Mr. Ventress some more, and that is when the police arrived and tased him. Mr. Thomas and Mr. Ventress are cousins. Mr. Thomas is presently under federal supervised probation based on the allegations in the affidavit and his present supervisory status. The state will request no bond in this matter.
Thomas, the court is going to find probable